I'm a big fan of Jesus, which is why I'm pretty bummed that most of the Christian movies I watch are, really bad. When I look at the history of Christian art, I see some of the most incredible, awe-inspiring creative works ever made by people. I see paintings and buildings that have changed the world and made meaningful imprints on the lives of those who've encountered them. I see artists who cared about the depths and subtleties of their crafts, people who were trying to be excellent at what they were doing. That feels really different from a lot of modern Christian art, like these scenes from 2014's Christian blockbuster, God's Not Dead.
Your results came back positive. You have cancer.
I don't have time for cancer.
Did you hear what I just said? I have cancer.
This couldn't wait until tomorrow.
What?
Something has clearly gone horribly wrong here. Whatever Christian art used to be, that's long gone. Most modern Christian movies clearly don't have the same commitment to quality, complexity, or even theological depth as the art of the past. And because I'm a Christian, I care a lot about why it's no longer as good as it used to be, as it clearly could be. Given that Christianity has been a gift to the art of human history, given that it's shown it should be fully able to inspire work that changes the world and the lives of the people in it, I want to know. Why are modern Christian movies so bad? To figure this out, we're going to take a close look at the artistic decisions behind God's Not Dead. By the time we finish with our analysis, we're going to understand not just why the movie is bad, but why its creators wanted it to be the way that it is. Why they intentionally worked towards making a movie that isn't good. I've seen plenty of other people online make video essays about God's Not Dead, but they're usually coming from people who aren't Christians and don't understand this movie's theological motivations as well as I do. I don't think they quite have the full story. Looking closely at this movie is our best shot at understanding why Christian movies in general are bad for two big reasons. The first is that the film achieved everything it set out to as a commercial product. While most Christian movies are only modestly profitable, this movie made around $100 million between its box office performance and home video sales. And that $100 million doesn't include the money the movie made through selling Bible studies and other licensed products. Despite the movie's many flaws, and believe me, we are going to go over a lot of them, there was a large audience ready and waiting to support a film like this, despite how bad it was. By taking a close look at God's Not Dead, we get to see the kind of content that a large portion of the American Christian audience currently wants to pay to see, and how that directly contributes to the movie's creative decisions. The second big reason we should look at God's Not Dead has to do with the fact that most modern Christian movies aren't just trying to entertain Christians, but to get the people who are watching who aren't Christians to convert to Christianity. Many secular reviews of Christian movies pin this as their death knell. Many claim that these films lack any chance of ever being good because they're too focused on evangelizing to non-believers. So I think that take is just extremely shallow. It implies that all the great Christian art of the past we just talked about was made without any thought being given to the idea that somebody might look at it and think, wow, Christianity is kinda cool. Or at the very least, that this Rembrandt painting of Jesus being taken down from the cross is a good painting, just in spite of the fact that it was almost certainly made with some degree of evangelistic motivations. No, God's Not Dead isn't bad and worth exploring because it evangelizes. It's bad and worth exploring because it evangelizes in a uniquely self-defeating way. Compared to other Christian movies, God's Not Dead has quite a lot to say about American Christianity's relationship with people who don't believe, and it seems to have an openly hostile attitude towards the people it supposedly wants to win over. Because of how successful this movie was, it did manage to influence a lot of non-Christians' opinions on Christianity. But in most cases, it led them to have a worse opinion of the religion than if they hadn't watched the movie at all. Which leaves us with an obvious question. If this movie was created for the purpose of bringing people to Jesus, why was it so bad at doing that? See, that's the thing. I don't think this movie actually cared about evangelizing or promoting Christianity much at all. I think its true goals, and the goals of a lot of Christian movies, are much less altruistic. Let's see if we can't figure out why that's the case. Let's take a close look at God's Not Dead. The movie is about a college student named Josh who enrolls in an entry-level philosophy class. Before he does this, he's provided a strange warning from an older student who catches a glance at the cross on his necklace. "You really shouldn't take that class," this older student tells him. "It's gonna be like stepping in the Roman Colosseum for you." On the first day of this class, his philosophy professor goes on a complete tirade. He stresses over and over that the only intellectually viable position to have regarding God is a firm commitment to the idea that no God exists. The The professor wants to skip over the pointless portion of his class that discusses the potential existence of God, and he proceeds to ask every student in the class to write on a piece of paper the words, "God is dead," and then sign their name to it and turn it into him. Every student in the class does this, except for Josh. Josh alone expresses discomfort at the idea and tells the professor that he can't go through with it because he's a Christian. The professor reacts to Josh's perfectly reasonable response with vitriolic disgust. The professor views this as a grievous challenge to his authority and tells Josh that because he's done this, he'll have to spend the next several class sessions defending the existence of God to the entire class, or else lose 30% of his final class grade. Josh hesitantly accepts the professor's challenge, under the condition that the class's students, the ones that all willingly wrote "God is dead" on a piece of paper a few minutes ago, those people will be the ones to decide whether he's been successful or not. Josh comes to feel that God is asking him to defend him, but nearly everybody else in his life disagrees. His girlfriend is upset that he's risking getting a good grade in this class, and thereby risking being accepted into law school. So she breaks up with him. But Josh just can't back down. After spending nearly all of his time studying, he crushes the professor's atheistic arguments with facts and logic. And then every student in the class stands up and says, "God is not dead." And then the mean, stupid professor gets run over by a car. But with his dying words, he completely 180s on everything he's ever said about Christianity and accepts Jesus. And while that's happening, Josh and every other side character in the movie I didn't talk about because their stories don't matter celebrate the victory of God by attending a Christian music concert led by Newsboys frontman and alleged safety threat to teenage boys, Michael Tate. I glossed over quite a bit there, but I hope you can already start to see that this movie has a lot of problems worth looking into. I don't think we can proceed with talking about this movie or any other Christian movie without first acknowledging that they don't seem committed to being honest about how the world really is. This is not a real philosophy class. There is not and has never been a philosophy class that works like this one, for a couple big reasons. Reason number one is none of this is legal. I've been hitting the books, and I can say with a high degree of confidence that discriminating against religious people and forcing a class to sign a piece of paper proclaiming the death of God or else face humiliation, it turns out that is very much not legal. Despite this, no one in the movie ever acknowledges that. Every character in the movie treats the situation like there's just nothing Josh can do. Josh tells a lot of people about what's happening, and from the earlier scenes in the movie, we know that this kind of thing has happened before, and at no point does anyone say, oh my gosh, Josh, I'm so sorry this is happening to you. Should we call that professor's boss? Do you need a lawyer? It doesn't happen because the movie isn't concerned with whether it would play out like this in real life or not. It just wants you to think that it could, despite the fact that's not true. I gave a look through the 36 court cases this movie featured at the beginning of its end credits, which it claims inspired its story. I wanted to see if any of them were similar to the story depicted in the movie. Only 2 of them involved a professor getting upset at a student for holding a religious belief, and in both cases, the professor ended up being disciplined by the school for their actions. Neither of these took place in philosophy-related classes. The professors in these cases were just weirdos. But too loud, you object. Stories don't have to be realistic to be good. There are all kinds of stories that take place in wild and wacky worlds that are just fine. Why are you picking on this movie for doing what other movies have done with no problem? To that I say, when people watch a Batman movie and see him running around the streets beating up bad guys, no one thinks to themselves, are you kidding me? Is that man dressing up as a bat, running around the city thinking he's above the law? Just watch what I would do if I caught Captain Spandex trying that in my small town. I tell you what. No, nobody does that because the Batman films aren't trying to convince us that Batman or Gotham City are representative of things in our world. But the makers of most Christian movies, including the makers of God's Not Dead, want you to believe that the worlds that they've created have real overlap with the world you and I live in. They want you to think that you, or someone you love, could have a guy like this as a professor, and that there's a good chance you're going to encounter somebody who's going to try to force you to renounce your Christian faith. Even though most professors wouldn't want to do that even if it was legal. And that's being dishonest, which the Bible I read seems to frown upon. Just like I'm gonna frown if you don't click the subscribe button below the video. My sources are telling me every person that doesn't subscribe is gonna be visited by this man who's going to force you to subscribe to my channel, or else you'll have to give a presentation to everybody else watching this video about why you didn't subscribe. Anyways, back to the video. The film isn't just willing to misrepresent the legality of the situation, it wants you to think that the abrasive, hardline atheistic views this professor has are representative of modern philosophy. About halfway through the movie, the main professor invites a bunch of other philosophy professors over to his house for a meal, and the professor's girlfriend happens to mention that she believes in God. And everybody in the room gives her the nastiest side eye, like, oh my gosh, can you believe this idiot girl thinks that God exists? I am way too smart to ever believe something so stupid like that. And earlier in the movie, the professor tries to make it seem like being 100% convinced of atheism is the only viable intellectual position one can have.
This semester I propose that we refuse to waste our limited time together debating the existence of the big man in the sky, the myth of a benevolent, all-powerful, supernatural being.
But if you know anything about philosophy of religion, you know that the last thing a professor who spent their whole life thinking about whether God exists would want to do is hand-wave the question away entirely. Even if a professor was firmly convinced that a God doesn't exist, they would want to talk about why they think that, why they don't find the arguments for God convincing. I mean, the entire shtick of philosophy is debating even the things that seem obvious, trying to find the most reasonable answer to hypothetical questions. And besides, this is supposed to be taking place in an entry-level class. Every entry-level philosophy of religion class covers both the arguments for and against the existence of God. They have to. While I was in college, I had a friend of mine convert to Christianity and decide to take a philosophy of religion course. During that course, she never got the vibe that the professor was trying to shake her faith in Christianity or prove to her that God didn't exist. And while I'm sure some people have had really bad outlier experiences in an environment like that, I think there's a reason why most people don't. Most philosophy professors think that there are at least some good reasons to believe that God exists, in addition to thinking that there are some good reasons to believe that God doesn't exist. Despite what the movie portrays, there are a ton of philosophers somewhere in the middle between Christian believers and hardcore atheists. A lot of them think a wide range of positions are intellectually viable. For example, Professor Philip Goff at the University of Durham thinks there's good evidence for believing a God exists, but not an all-powerful one considering the amount of suffering that exists in the world. I don't think he's right about that last part, but I bring it up to show that philosophy professors are not laughing off the idea that God exists, and portraying them as only adhering to a strict form of atheism is dishonest. So if philosophy departments aren't actually festering with hatred for Christianity, why is the movie so committed to showing them that way? Well, I think the answer to that question can be found in this movie's strange obsession with Professor Emeritus of Evolutionary Biology at Oxford and outspoken critic of religion, Richard Dawkins. Despite the fact that Richard Dawkins isn't a philosophy professor and has never taught philosophy in any capacity, his name comes up several times throughout God's Not Dead as an authoritative voice. I think the most telling mention we get of him is this interaction here.
So then he claims that Dawkins is the one who's in error. I know, as if Dawkins' thought was to make sure that...
Jeffrey, I'm leaving you.
As far as this movie is concerned, a philosophy professor would not tolerate disrespect of Richie D. But in real life, I've only ever heard philosophy professors make fun of Richard Dawkins' beliefs. What gives? You see, in the wake of 9/11, Richard authored a best-selling book called The God Delusion, in which he argued against the existence of God. He also became a leader in the anti-religious pseudo-intellectual movement called New Atheism. I call it pseudo-intellectual not because Richard isn't a smart man. He's got a PhD in biology and taught at Oxford. I'm sure he knows a ton about his area of expertise. No, the New Atheist movement was pseudo-intellectual because it cared more about bullying religious people than it did about saying and believing correct things.
I think that to ground your morality certainly in the Bible would be an appalling thing to do.
Who's the most formidable debate opponent that you have had in your career that you can think of now on this question of God's existence?
I don't think there are any.
Richard Dawkins refuses to meaningfully engage with the philosophy of religion, and instead seems to be content with mocking any attempt to argue for God's existence in quite a triumphalistic and arrogant way. This means his rhetoric hasn't garnered favor with philosophers, even the ones that are firmly atheists. Despite the fact that Richard really didn't know what he was talking about when it came to God, he was able to convince many people that religion is bad and religious people are stupid. Wait, hold on. I'm getting deja vu. Where have I seen this Richard guy before?
Oh, a lowercase g. Maybe this one ought to get extra credit. But there are some flat earthers out there who still consider the existence of a supreme deity to be either necessary or self-evident or both. In that classroom, there is a God, and yet I'm him. You have no idea how much I'm going to enjoy failing you.
The professor in this movie acts the way that he does, not because philosophy professors in real life are harassing college kids over their religious beliefs, but because the writers of this movie saw Richard Dawkins making fun of Christians and thought, let me get back at him by making him the villain in my Christian movie and running him over with a car. Even if I ignore the fact that that's definitely not the attitude Jesus wants his followers to have towards their enemies, it's clear this movie is intentionally misrepresenting philosophy professors' attitudes and what their classroom environments are like. And I think that's wrong. After asking for advice about his class, Josh gets a text from a local pastor saying he needs to be content with telling the truth. And I agree 100%. If Jesus is the truth as he describes himself as being, I think the idea of being dishonest to try and support Christianity is nonsense. It's just a shame that the writers of Christian movies don't often seem to agree with me. The second big reason why Christian movies usually aren't very good is their inability to portray non-Christian characters as being morally decent people. God's Not Dead really hates the characters it supposedly wants to convert to Christianity. Every character that doesn't convert to Christianity, and a few of the ones that do, are comically overwhelmingly evil. This reporter has an I Love Evolution bumper sticker on her car. When she interviews Duck Dynasty Guy, she claims people are offended that he prays to Jesus. Her boyfriend commits criminal insider trading, and when she asks him for directions, he tells her, "What's in it for me?"
What's in it for me?
You're kidding, right?
You're serious.
The professor is a creep who dates his students. When his girlfriend leaves him, he says,
You can't do that. I won't accept it.
I'm sorry.
But I said I don't accept that. I won't allow it.
The professor doesn't just think that Josh is wrong about believing in God, he hates this man's guts and talks openly about trying to ruin his life.
But know this, if you truly feel a need to continue with this charade, I will make it my personal mission to destroy any hope of a law degree in your future.
But too loud. Is it really all that bad to show characters like that? Aren't some atheists really like that? Sometimes I go on r/atheism, and those guys really do hate religious people, and probably even have I Love Evolution bumper stickers on the back of their cars. To answer that question, we need to understand the difference between talking about the bad things real people have done and talking about the bad things fictional characters do. You see, I just made a video going over all the horrible, just despicable things that Brigham Young, the second leader of the Mormon Church, did when he was alive. And I don't think it's wrong to talk about those things, because they happen to real people in real life. In fact, I think it's good to talk about those things. But let's say I go and write a novel. I write it about a fictional character I call Mickey the Mormon. And I tell you that even though I'm making the story up, it was inspired by real events. In it, I make Mickey's main personality trait his irritability, and I show him shoving javelins through his wives. Brigham Young did that in real life, so does that make this story okay? I think the answer is obviously no. Just because Brigham Young killed people doesn't mean the average Mormon is going around killing people. In fact, the vast majority of Mormons have never killed anybody at all. And so, if I try to pass off my made-up character Mickey as being correspondent to something in our world, I'm no longer just criticizing the real crimes of the real Brigham Young my character is based on. I've started placing the idea in people's heads that it's normal for Mormons to kill people, despite the fact that that's not true. Just imagine for a second if a bunch of angry atheists got together and made a movie like God's Not Dead that supported atheism instead of Christianity. Imagine that they fill that movie with a bunch of hypocritical Christian characters that only do horrible things and beat their children. I and every other Christian would be rightfully offended at that. We would instantly see that the film is trying to insinuate that Christianity leads people to doing bad things. We would rush to point out that the movie misrepresents us and other Christians that we know. We might even bust out some statistics to show that Christians aren't more violent than other groups in the population. But when God's Not Dead has one practicing Muslim character and has him beat the snot out of his daughter for listening to a sermon on her iPod, despite the fact that Muslims in the US aren't more likely to commit domestic violence than the general population, not only is it not a problem anymore, it's a movie worth giving $100 million to. No non-Christian soul watched this movie and came out thinking that its creators, or even Christians in general, care about or respect them at all. The movie goes out of its way to show that the non-Christian characters are evil because the people who wrote those characters don't like people who aren't Christians. If you care about a group of people, you don't make a movie slandering them. It's just that simple. Now to that you might say, doesn't Jesus speak out harshly against his critics in the New Testament? If Jesus was okay with framing his critics harshly, shouldn't it be okay for Christian movies to do that? I think that line of thinking has two big problems. The first is that Jesus' criticisms are directed at real people and the real sins that they've committed. Unlike God's Not Dead, Jesus isn't misrepresenting anything his critics are saying or doing. The second is that Jesus wasn't just reacting harshly against people who didn't like him. He spoke out against the Pharisees specifically. The Pharisees were a group of religious leaders who Jesus thought were being hypocritical. According to Jesus, they knew the Jewish law well enough to be accountable for their actions, and yet cared more about obeying man-made rules than they did loving God or loving other people. No, the Pharisees don't make for a great point of comparison to the non-Christians we see featured in God's Not Dead. But there is a better example of Jesus telling a story about people he disagreed with theologically that we could compare to the film. The parable of the Good Samaritan. In the Bible, the Samaritans were the descendants of the tribes of Israel that rebelled against the royal line of King David and formed a separate nation that was eventually conquered by the Assyrian Empire. They began to worship other gods besides the God of Israel and assimilated with the nations around them, leading to a Jewish pagan hybrid culture and religion. The Jews and the Samaritans both hated each other because they both had radically different interpretations of the history of Israel and how God was to be worshipped. They both saw each other as blasphemers. And Jesus explicitly taught that Samaritan ideas about God were completely wrong. If Jesus wanted to tell a story that would have been a crowd pleaser, all he'd have to do is portray the Samaritans as the villains, or at least paint them in as bad as light as possible, and the audience that already hated them would have absolutely loved that. But instead, Jesus did the exact opposite. The story is really short, so I'm just going to read it in its entirety. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus replied, "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" The man answered, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "Right," Jesus told him, "do this, and you will live." The man wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. The next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. If the bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here." Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked. The man replied, "The one who showed him mercy." Then Jesus said, "Yes, now go and do the same." Does the story in God's Not Dead sound like it comes from the same religion as the story Jesus told about the Good Samaritan? It sure doesn't to me. In the story Jesus tells, he feels no need to stress that the Samaritan believes the wrong things about God, despite the fact that Jesus thinks his religion is wrong and his audience is predisposed to hating him. Jesus has no problem with acknowledging that his own people are capable of being hypocrites, and in this example, that they would have let a man die because helping him would have been too inconvenient for them. When the Samaritan man sacrifices his time and his money to help somebody that almost assuredly would have hated him under less disadvantageous circumstances, Jesus doesn't tack on an ending where the Samaritan man realizes he's been wrong about God and converts to Judaism. Jesus is content to leave his audience in their discomfort because he doesn't think their discomfort is morally justifiable, because he doesn't hate Samaritans like they do. God's Not Dead doesn't feel like it shares any ideological relationship with the parable of the Good Samaritan because the theological underpinnings of Jesus' story are absent from this modern film. God's Not Dead certainly presents itself as caring about sharing the good news of Jesus with people who don't believe. But nearly every time we see those people on screen, they're portrayed as moral monsters, as people who deserve your animosity. God's Not Dead wasn't made to evangelize. Its not-so-subtle subtext was made to criticize without concerning itself with representing people fairly. I don't think God's Not Dead and many other Christian movies do a good job of showing Christ-like love to people who aren't Christians at all. I want to close out this thought by highlighting the scene in the movie I think I dislike the most. I mentioned earlier that every other student in this decently sized class besides Josh follows the professor's initial set of instructions and agrees that God is dead. There's something viscerally unsettling about what the movie is trying to convey here. The writers want us to think that, en masse, the average college student would willingly and dispassionately blaspheme God. The writers could have had them write, "I don't believe a God exists," or even, "I'm confident that God doesn't exist." But apparently, that wouldn't have been far enough. No, according to God's Not Dead, the average college class would proclaim the death of God, renunciate any possibility of God's existence, and stamp their name to it. This isn't some kind of oversight either. Later, the movie claims that none of them would even be willing to step into a church.
How many people in that class? 80, maybe.
And how many of them do you think would ever step foot in here or any other church for that matter?
Well, none, probably.
But as somebody who spent time at a university recently, I can tell you with a high degree of confidence that most college students aren't like that. Religious studies was one of my majors in college, and I actually spent some time working for the religious studies department as an employee. I got to see the data on how many students were taking courses on Christianity, and it was hundreds every year. Despite the fact that my school offered courses in a ton of different religious concentrations, over 50% of the people who declared a major or minor in religious studies did so concentrating in Christianity. You know, I don't know how many of those people were practicing themselves, but they were at least interested enough in Christianity to want to learn more about it. The idea that the average college student is chomping at the bit to sign this professor's piece of paper is just a fantasy. It's not real. This movie wants Christians to think that society at large is a hair trigger away from sentencing us to meet in underground churches and banning the Bible. That most normal people out and about in the real world think to themselves, "I would never step foot in a church. Ugh, if I had the choice between getting shot and stepping foot in a church right now, I would get shot." Personally, I had a ton of friends in college who weren't Christian, and when I asked them if they'd be interested in coming to church with me, they were, and they did. Nobody spit in my face, nobody called me an idiot. That's just not something the average person in America is going to do. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that people are always nice and rosy to Christians. There are exceptions, believe me, I've definitely met some of them. But at least in America right now, there aren't nearly as many people hostile to religion as this movie would lead you to believe. So, if God's Not Dead doesn't care about representing the real world accurately, and it doesn't care about evangelizing to non-Christians, what is it trying to do? The movie sure does talk about defending God a lot. Could it be about that? Maybe if it's not trying to win over people who aren't Christians, it's trying to convince people who are already Christians that there are good reasons to believe that Christianity is true. That leads us into our third reason why modern Christian movies aren't very good. They often portray belief in Christianity as overwhelmingly obvious and don't feel the need to make Christianity compelling or convincing. That might sound strange given the central conflict of this movie, but the film spends a remarkably short amount of time discussing the arguments for God's existence. It really only brings up a couple, and each is given only a few minutes of screen time. The movie and I are in agreement when it comes to God being the best explanation for how something could come from nothing and how life could come from non-life. But my thinking diverges pretty significantly from the movie when it comes to how much those ideas can accomplish. Remember, many philosophers are agnostic or atheistic, not because they think there are no good reasons to believe in God, but because they think there are also good reasons to not believe in God. And as they've weighed each argument or piece of evidence, they think the scale tips more towards God not existing or towards us not being able to know if God exists. In order to make Christianity compelling to a room full of hardened atheists, the movie would have to do two things. The first is present strong, positive evidence for why Christianity is true. The second is offering convincing reasons for why common objections to Christianity, like why would a good God allow for the amount of evil and suffering that we see in the world, shouldn't carry as much weight. I mentioned the problem of evil specifically because it's the only criticism the movie takes a stab at solving. Josh tells his class that God allows for evil things because they're necessary for humans to have free will. Then the movie quickly moves on, and he never elaborates on that point. Earlier in the film, Josh claims that his arguments aren't silver bullets, which to me implies that a reasonable person could hear them and not be convinced.
Atheists say that no one can prove the existence of God, and they're right.
But later in the film, his attitude completely changes.
You've seen the science and the arguments. Science supports his existence. You know the truth.
I've done enough to prove that God exists, Josh says. You know the truth, Professor. You don't have any good reason to not believe in Jesus. And I think the movie is tipping its hand here. I think earlier in the film, when God's Not Dead said it couldn't prove the existence of God, I think it was lying through its teeth. Despite that, I think the movie leaves room for a ton of reasonable questions. Here are some questions I would still have if I was an atheist after listening to Josh's lectures. What are the best naturalistic explanations for the something from nothing problem and the origin of life? Why is God a better explanation? Why is free will enough of a justification to explain why excessive evils like the Holocaust happen? Couldn't a smaller amount of evil be enough to satisfy free will? What about evils that happen to beings like animals who don't have any moral agency? Is human free will enough to justify an animal getting burned alive in a forest fire? If there's a God, then why do so many people go their entire lives without ever seeing any reason to believe in him or having any kind of religious experiences? Wouldn't a good God want those people to believe in him? Even if a God does exist, why should I believe in the Christian God? You're not mishearing things. You heard that right. This Christian movie about defending the existence of God doesn't actually offer any defenses of God that couldn't also apply to another monotheistic religion. It doesn't argue for why Christianity is true. Now remember, I'm a Christian. I think there's good reasons to be Christian. I have ways that I would personally address each of the questions that I just brought up. But I don't think an atheist asking any of those questions would be unreasonable or acting in bad faith. And I could easily see why the evidence presented in the film wouldn't be enough to convince somebody, especially given the film's treatment of people who aren't Christians. It's also worth noting that while the professor spends a significant amount of time in the movie mocking belief in God, he doesn't actually give us that many reasons for why he feels that way. So, what arguments against God does the professor actually use? I could only find two. In the first argument, the professor describes the emergence of religion as a sociological phenomenon, used as a catch-all to provide answers for questions that were unexplainable in the past.
He was a useful fairy tale in ages gone by, when his fiery anger was used to explain away plagues and crop failures, diseases and disasters, which we now ascribe to bacteria and viruses, chromosomal disorders and plate tectonics. In short, science and reason have supplanted superstition, and we are all the better for it.
The second argument appears to be a logical problem of evil, the idea that if an all-good, all-powerful God exists, there can be no kinds of evil at all.
One day, I will get rid of all the evil in the world, but until then, you just have to deal with all the wars and Holocaust, tsunamis, poverty, starvation, and AIDS. Have a nice life.
So, I think both of these arguments against God are presented pretty poorly. The first says that if we can come up with a naturalistic explanation for how religions came about, those are the ones we should accept. It doesn't explain why, it doesn't elaborate. A hypothetical isn't a logical defeater. And the second argument, this film's version of the problem of evil, is pretty underdeveloped compared to the versions present in academia today. Those arguments usually focus on the amount of suffering that we see. Does it really have to be as much as it is? And the types of suffering that we see. Why would a good God create a world in which animals that can't understand the world around them and can't make free will decisions die excruciating deaths? I bring this up because knowing that the movie isn't really concerned with presenting good arguments for God's existence and isn't really concerned with having sincere engagement with the good arguments against God's existence makes it all the more confusing why this movie even exists at all. What on earth is the point of centering this movie around an academic showdown if the film is completely uninterested in having any kind of academic showdown? Well, I think this is another example of this movie exerting some sleight of hand. Let's listen in again on Josh telling the professor he should know God exists.
You've seen the science in the arguments. Science supports his existence. You know the truth. So why do you hate him? It's a very simple question, Professor. Why do you hate God?
Because he took everything away from me. Yes, I hate God. All I have for him is hate.
Womp womp. At the climax of the movie, the professor reveals he wasn't an atheist because he believed the arguments against God were good. He was just mad at God because his mom died. The professor's professed motivations weren't sincere at all. This whole movie, he was just having an emotional outburst, not a logical one. At the end of the movie, the professor becomes a Christian right before he dies. Not because he thought he had a good reason to believe in God, but because... Actually, that's a difficult question. Why does he completely change his mind at the end of the movie? You're telling me he was mad at God for letting his mom die, and he was mad enough about it to terrorize anyone religious who stepped into his classroom, but when God lets him get hit by a car, he decides, whatever, I'm on Team Jesus now. Hey, could you play Oceans for me while I die? Thank you, that really helps take the pain away. The professor's motivations and near-death change of attitude reveal that the writers of God's Not Dead didn't think that atheism was worth engaging sincerely. From the movie's point of view, atheistic thoughts and concerns about Christianity can be easily dismissed because they aren't sincere. In the New Testament, Paul spends a lot of time trying to reason people into Christianity by engaging with their philosophies and traditions directly. Paul, of course, believed that Christianity was true, but he didn't assume that the people he was preaching to should convert without having good reasons to believe that. God's Not Dead doesn't seem to share those same attitudes. The reason why Josh thinks he's proven God to the professor is not because he thinks his arguments were super convincing, but because he doesn't think he needs to present Christianity as compelling at all. When the professor said he didn't believe in God, he didn't mean it. He already knows the truth. Christian movies would be a lot better off if they formed their rhetoric like Paul did, if they cared about giving other people convincing reasons to think it's true instead of being convinced they already should. I still haven't answered why I think this movie is making all of these terrible decisions, and I promise I'm gonna get there in a second, but I think there's one more problem we need to tackle first. I anticipate one of the criticisms I'm gonna receive for that last section of the video going as follows. Too loud. You're asking way too much of this film. The movie is more about getting Christians to be excited about standing up for their faith than it is about fleshing out good reasons to believe in God. It's just not as deep as you're making it out to be. And to that I say, I don't think this movie, or many other Christian movies, understand what faith even is. One of the major side plots of the movie involves a pastor and his missionary friend. They keep trying to go on vacation, but are repeatedly prevented from doing so by a series of unfortunate events that keep them from starting their journey. Towards the end of the movie, the missionary prays for God to let their car start because the past several cars that they've tried to rent have all been unable to run. When the pastor goes to check and see if this car will finally be the one to start, his missionary friend stops him and tells him that checking the car before they put their bags in the trunk shows a lack of faith on his part. He complies with the missionary's request. They put their bags in the car, and glory to God, would you believe that car started right up, and they attribute that to their faith. I think this scene has really, really bad theology. I don't think faith in God looks like this at all, actually. You see, there's a really big difference between blind faith and what I'm going to call biblical faith. To understand the difference between the two, I'm going to steal a metaphor from the late great author and pastor, Tim Keller. If somebody walks out onto a frozen lake, believing that the ice is going to hold them up, but in actuality, the ice is really thin, they're going to fall through regardless of how much faith they have in the ice. On the other hand, if somebody is hesitant and barely steps out onto the ice, but the ice is thick, they're going to stay standing despite the fact they had little faith. The point is that it's not the strength of their faith that keeps them standing. It's the strength of the ice, the object of their faith. We see this in the Bible. Paul says that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, Christians are pathetic, because that would mean Jesus, the object of the Christian faith, can't save us from our sins. That's why Paul spent so much time trying to convince people that Jesus was who he said he was. If Jesus rose from the dead, Christians have reason to hope. But God's Not Dead doesn't seem to promote that kind of faith. It wants the pastor to put his bags in the trunk before he checks the engine, despite the fact that they seem to have good reason to believe that it's not going to start. The movie feels that the professor is obligated to step out onto the lake without giving him good reason to believe that he's not going to fall through. Prayer and faith aren't some kind of rain dance that we do to force God to give us the things that we want. No, it's quite the opposite. Real faith doesn't look like praying for your car to start and assuming that that has to be the will of God. It looks like Jesus' prayer before his crucifixion. Yes, the Bible says that we should pray to God for the things that we want, but faith looks like believing that God's will is still best, even if what we want doesn't come to pass. My prayers don't make God do what I want, but if I pray for God to do what he thinks is good and just, those prayers will be answered, because in them, the unshakable object those prayers depend on won't fail. So, if God's Not Dead isn't committed to telling a story honestly, if it doesn't actually care about the people it's claiming to try and reach, if it's not concerned with making Christianity compelling or convincing, and if it doesn't understand the faith it's asking people to stand up for, then what is this movie trying to do? For all of the talking I've done, I think that's really simple. I think it's the same reason this movie did so well financially. All of its creative decisions are centered around creating an American Christian power fantasy. Unlike the parable of the Good Samaritan, which disempowered its audience for the sake of getting them to think critically about their actions and beliefs, which wanted them to examine their professed love for God and people and see if it was consistent with how they were treating their enemies, God's Not Dead sought to cultivate the exact opposite within its audience. Do you think people are out to get you? Believe me, it's worse than you could possibly imagine. You think most people who aren't Christians absolutely loathe Christianity and would ruin your life if given the chance? You've got it, buddy. That's exactly right. No need to look at yourself, pal. You're as right as rain, says the film. Absolutely no notes from me. In the wake of the very real bullying that took place by the New Atheist movement, many Christians in America felt rejected by their surrounding culture. They saw that their ideas and institutions were losing relevance and influence, and became extremely frustrated that they couldn't seem to reverse it. Instead of looking for a way to repay that bullying with kindness, to extend forgiveness and grace to the people mocking them, who were really only a vocal minority of Americans, many Christians retaliated with contempt for them. God's Not Dead was able to get away with slandering non-Christians and misrepresenting society because by doing that, it was able to give its audience the feeling of power they so desperately wanted. By the end of the film, Josh has convinced many people that Christianity is true. The movie tells us he did that by being smarter than the secular academic instruction he was presented with. He's humiliated the professor who desperately tried to humiliate him. Despite everybody in his life being against him, he walks away with a happy ending, and Richard Dawkins gets hit by a car and dies. Unlike any of us, the Bible sets out Jesus as having the ability to enact out this power fantasy. He says that himself right before he's crucified. "I'm not going to the grave because I can't fight back," he says. "I could call down 12 legions of angels at any time to fight for me." But Jesus doesn't do that. The Bible says that God in the flesh denied himself and chose to die the humiliating death of a criminal out of love for humanity. Jesus said that he expects his followers to be willing to do the same. After everything that we've discussed, do you think that Jesus would have signed off on a movie like this? Do you think that God, willing to go to a cross, would have approved of what this movie was trying to do, of how it went about doing it? I definitely don't. The ending of God's Not Dead gives significant screen time to former Newsboys frontman and alleged threat to teenage boys, Michael Tate. The reporter with cancer interviews his band to find out why they believe in God. They give the milquetoast responses you'd expect, and then Michael Tate asks God to save the reporter's soul. I'm not going to hold it against the creators of the film for including Tate in the movie. After all, the film was released over a decade before the allegations against Tate were made public. Rather, I'm highlighting the film's usage of Tate, a man who presented himself as a man of God, a professional Christian who, in reality, was more of a moral monster than any of the caricatured atheists in the film, as a uniquely fitting way for the movie to end. I mentioned earlier that Jesus was quite harsh with the Pharisees because of their hypocrisy, and I'd like to expound upon that a little bit more here. The Pharisaic leaders believed that God had punished the nation of Israel because the nation hadn't done a good enough job of obeying God's laws. To prevent this from ever happening again, they created additional laws on top of the past revelation that God had given to make sure, under absolutely any circumstances, they couldn't break any of God's rules and bring judgment upon themselves. But Jesus hated this mindset. Throughout the Gospels, he's constantly pointing out how the Pharisees can obey their rules without ever loving God or loving other people. They could practice their religion, they could keep their traditions without ever having to change their hearts or character. This aesthetic and legalistic devotion to God, the idea that one is in right standing with God depending on what they do or the vibe that they give off, it's completely antithetical to everything that Jesus taught. And yet, it's hard not to see exactly that happening with Michael Tate in this movie. Michael Tate's job before he admitted to misconduct was to be a Christian musician. He worshiped God for a living. When someone in the film comes to him and asks him about Jesus, he says the right words. He prays the right prayer.
God, we're asking you would save her, change her, cleanse her, give her a fresh start, Lord. Let her know that she's loved. And more importantly, that she is loved by you, the master of the universe.
So even though his actions, his appearance, and his traditions are very different from those of the Pharisees from 2,000 years ago, this movie wants us to look at Michael Tate and call him a Christian, when by Jesus' teachings, he isn't. And many Christian movies are guilty of the same. They care more about appearing Christian, about communicating their ideas in a wholesome-looking package, than they do about telling the truth or loving other people. If you tell somebody to go to hell in a letter covered in crosses, what you're doing is still wrong. God's Not Dead can appear Christian while actually undermining Christian values because that's what the audience that gave it $100 million cared more about. At the beginning of the book of Revelation, the risen Jesus is sending messages out to 7 churches in Asia Minor. In his message to the church in Ephesus, Jesus calls them out for abandoning their love for him and threatens to remove their lampstand if they don't repent of their sins. The lampstands here represent the churches themselves. What Jesus is saying here is that the sin of the church of Ephesus was harming his efforts to make himself known throughout the world. If they repented, they could keep their lampstand and continue to shine the light of Jesus out into the dark lives of the people around them. But if they didn't repent, if they didn't turn away from their sins, if they continued being bad representatives of Jesus, he would judge them and take their church away. Yes, Michael Tate looked like a Christian. He made quite a lot of money because of that. But he wasn't. He hurt people, and in doing so, he damaged the reputation of Christ on the earth. And God judged him for that. What about us? Does the church today care more about appearing Christian than being Christian? Do we care about the character of our Christian leaders, the messaging of our Christian media, about checking our own hearts for sin? Do we care more about exalting ourselves than we do caring about the people and God we're supposed to love? I think bad Christian art is a fixable problem. I think that most of the problems in God's Not Dead have more to do with bad theology than they do bad acting or directing. Christian art can be a wonderful thing if it comes from the right place. But if the American church keeps supporting media that hurts the reputation of Christianity, if it keeps rallying behind the lies it wants to hear instead of the introspective truths it so desperately needs, then God will take away our lampstand too. On a brighter note, if you'd like to see more stuff from me, go ahead and click the video on screen to watch more. Let me know if you'd like me to make more videos like this. If you do, I'll make more.